Hello and welcome to the Recent Advances Plenary for ESA 2021. I am Sarah Emery, a professor at the University of Louisville and program chair for this meeting. I want to thank all of you for participating in this year's virtual meeting. Even considering our less than ideal conditions, I have heard many exciting presentations and participated in many stimulating discussions this week, a lot which have highlighted this year's theme, Vital Connections in Ecology. I especially want to thank the volunteer members of this year's program committee and the Future Meetings Committee who were instrumental in pulling this conference together. I also want to thank ESA staff members who have worked tirelessly this past year to make informed decisions regarding meeting format, to renegotiate convention-centered contracts, and to develop the best online meeting possible. I am very happy today to introduce Dr. Kelly Ramirez as this year's Recent Advances speaker. Dr. Ramirez is a microbial ecologist and assistant professor at the University of Texas in El Paso. Dr. Ramirez has a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of Colorado and a BA in biology from Washington State University. She not only conducts brilliant research focusing on understanding the influences of global changes on soil biodiversity and plant microbe interactions, which is a topic that is very near and dear to my own interests. She is also a leader in science policy and public engagement. She has served as the executive director for the Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative and has held postdoctoral fellowships in the Global Sustainability Leadership Program at Colorado State, with the Synthesis Center of Biodiversity in Germany and at the Netherlands Institute of Ecology. Perhaps most notably, with regards to her talk today, she is the co-founder and president of 500 Women Scientists, a grassroots organization committed to building support networks for women scientists and confronting racism, misogyny, xenophobia, and anti-science rhetoric in order to build a more inclusive scientific community. Founded in 2016, 500 Women Scientists now has more than 20,000 supporters across 100 countries, but works to build community via small groups rather than large crowds. Dr. Ramirez and her work with 500 Women Scientists immediately came to mind as I was developing the theme for this year's meeting, Vital Connections in Ecology, because of her commitment to highlighting and facilitating human connections in science between mentors, students, and collaborators, with community stakeholders, and with friends and family. Welcome, Dr. Ramirez.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me, inviting me to give this Recent Advances in Ecology lecture. I am really, really excited. I am going to try to do this correctly. Okay, hi, my name is Dr. Kelly Ramirez. I am an assistant professor at the University of Texas at El Paso. I am also co-founder of 500 Women Scientists. I am recording this lecture today from Boulder, Colorado, and it is 97 degrees, so I'm a little bit warm and my dog may bark, but we're all used to that now that we've been on Zoom for a year and a half. So I'm going to be speaking today about how the future of ecology can be open, inclusive, and accessible. Before I start, I want to acknowledge my privilege as a cis, hetero, able-bodied white woman. I have had supportive mentors and peers throughout my scientific career, and together this has undoubtedly allowed me and helped me reach the career stage I am at today. So even though I'm going to be talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice, I think it's important to acknowledge your privilege where you're speaking from. I also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute lands. I live in El Paso on Apache and Mescalero lands, and this photo was taken in Yosemite National Park on Central Sierra Miwok lands. I also need to point out that I could not have reached this level of knowledge on equity and inclusion and created 500 Women Scientists. Obviously I didn't create it. It was with an amazing team of individuals over the last 4.5 years. Here's a photo of our executive leadership team that has been working tirelessly. Jane Zelikova, Lauren Edwards, Stephanie Bodison, Liz McCullough, Miriam Zering-Hallam. These are not the only people that have been instrumental. There are many, many more. You can check them out on our website, but I just need to say that I would not be here, 500 Women Scientists would not be here today without this amazing group. So what has COVID changed? Everything. We have lost friends and family. We have had our education and career paths altered, and our daily routines, however basic, have been upended. And I want to start my talk today acknowledging how COVID has changed everything and what this means for us as individuals, as scientists, and the world of ecology. And it may seem silly, there are all these illustrations, cartoons out there highlighting, kind of joking about what we miss and don't miss with COVID. But to me, connecting with other humans, traveling to meetings, coming home after a long day of productive or unproductive work can be really, really important. And I really miss those things. COVID has also shone a light on the inequalities that persist in our society, because there has been a disproportionate impact on communities of color, immigrants, women and parents, poor and disabled. And we need to acknowledge that as we move forward, as the pandemic persists, and if there is a point where we aren't dealing with COVID on a daily basis, how can we create a society that breaks down these inequities? I want to zoom in on one facet of those inequities that our organization, 500 Women Scientists, has done a lot of work on. Scientist mothers. And you can follow the hashtag SciMomJourneys on Twitter and Instagram if you want to learn more, also on our website. This is Gretchen Goldman. She became viral this last year when she posted this tweet, "Just so I'm being honest." Here she is on the left, sitting at what looks like to be a very organized area, interviewing for CNN, talking about a new environmental position that was relevant. However, when we look to the right, we see what her life was really like, having children while working from home. And this is funny, but also you can really just see the strain being put on scientist mothers. However, it is, and I also want to add that women scientists of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color face even steeper hurdles than white women in parenting scenarios during COVID. These inequities make clear that there are many steps that scientific institutions and colleagues can and should take now to alleviate the burden and to start to address inevitable inequities that will be exacerbated by COVID. So some potential solutions: how can scientist mothers be supported? Extending contracts and funding, 1 semester teaching releases, temporary no-cost release from service, pausing the tenure clock, and reconsidering student evaluations. I think this also brings to light, the pandemic has made clear that many of the accommodations that employers are now willing to make, such as working from home, could have been made sooner. For years, disabled and STEM advocates asked for the ability to work from home and flexibility of assignments, but met resistance. These are the same accommodations that scientific institutions are now making for all staff. So we live in an able-bodied world. Ableism is prevalent. And we need to acknowledge that as soon as able-bodied people were put at risk by the pandemic, we immediately were making changes for that community. But for years, the disabled community has been ignored and likely will continue to be ignored unless we start taking actionable steps. I'm going to open my water. It's not a beer, it's a Spindrift. I'm sorry, I'm very thirsty. COVID has also highlighted our lack of empathy for mental health, stress, anxiety, depression, etc. And recent research has shown that people's anxiety and depressive symptoms have increased during the pandemic. Pre-existing mental and physical health diagnoses, daily COVID-related media, conflicting COVID information, and secondary stressors were all associated with acute stress and depressive symptoms found by Holman et al. In Science Advances last year. We also saw a 9% increase in depressive symptoms in the UK and a 31% increase in anxiety or depression symptoms in the US. This is a significant issue that COVID has exacerbated, and moving forward, just like considering what accommodations can be made for parents, for disabled, what accommodations can be made for people with mental health struggles. And this is not something that is just within one community. This is so prevalent across the United States that the CDC has a coping page when you Google mental health and COVID, because it is so important. It has impacted our society so immensely. They remind us to pause and breathe, take breaks from upsetting content, take care of your body, reach out and stay connected, and seek help if you're feeling unwell, overwhelmed, or unsafe. So amidst all of this, our academic lives we've been asked to go on, maybe from home, maybe in a more chaotic setting, but we're still going on, teaching courses online, trying to figure out how we can take our lab and research from in-person to maybe some sort of bioinformatics. But we need to really talk about how we cannot simply return to normal for these reasons that I just talked about before. Many more people are being allowed to work from home. How can we continue to accommodate those who have been marginalized and suppressed by the past systems before COVID? I also now want to talk about how we have adjusted to COVID. I want to give a shout out to graduate students who have entered graduate students, tried to finish graduate school, entered graduate school, left it, or just trying to maintain their research. Like, really, I'm super proud of the people who are there. I can't imagine graduate school not being in person, because you get mental support from your colleagues and peers. You collaborate with people, and that's where you do your work, right, on campus. So to those of you who are in graduate school, great work, and keep it up. And find a support network online. And actually, some of those graduate students who graduated last year had some words of support and suggestions for those of you who are in this position. This is Farah Kaiser. She's a on 500 women scientist and a master. She graduated with her master's from University of Toronto. She says, firstly, well done, and take your time to celebrate, even if it's virtual. Also, hone your skills and network, because moving forward, even if you've lost a year or maybe two, that your skills and network will still be there as you move forward in the world. And finally, be realistic. Go easy on yourself. If you find you need to move back in with your parents, that's totally fine. This is a judgment-free space as we move forward during the pandemic, after the pandemic, because our lives have been upended, and we need to remember that and be forgiving to ourselves and others. Teaching, oh my gosh. What a year and a half we have had. But there is some silver lining. The collective consensus in our fields of ecology and evolution is that we can continue to improve and innovate on existing developments. And more broadly and importantly, this provides an opportunity to reset some of the existing practices that fail to promote an effective and inclusive learning environment. This is from Lashley et al. 2020. And I think that's great. It was challenging. We can acknowledge that. And we can also acknowledge and find avenues and processes that were more beneficial while we were online. What things can we keep that will benefit our students and keep the learning environment inclusive? Faculty also, if biology faculty, beyond just teaching, your research was impacted. And this study showed that people assumed that there will be a lasting impact, whether that's from 0 to 3 months up to a year, impacts of COVID on their lab and field. And women respondents, assistant professors, and those who care for at least one child or teenager were significantly more dissatisfied with their work-life balance during this pandemic than others. This paper, if you want to go read it, explains how the community, the scientific community, our ecology community is impacted by COVID, and how academic policies can be improved in the future to continue to support faculty productivity and welfare. So why do I bring all of this up in a talk about equity and inclusion? Obviously, COVID was disproportionately impacted marginalized groups in our society. As individuals, though, we also cannot be our best scientists if we are not supported by our peers, our colleagues, our department, our university for who we are as an individual. And so I want to introduce this concept of intersectionality by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. And this is the idea that the acknowledgement that an individual's race, gender, culture, sexual orientation, disability, socioeconomic backgrounds, and other facets can result in disadvantages and discrimination throughout their scientific career, And this is so, so true for science as well. Science and scientific institutions are far from inclusive and have a long history of discrimination, harassment, and inequity that have repeatedly marginalized individuals that are not male or white. And I think that we need to support and elevate individual scientists. And to do that, we must approach science and decision-making within science with an intersectional lens. And so I'm next going to talk about some recent advances that have been made in ecology and STEM regarding justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. There's been some really great work over the last year. Actually, this is from a few years ago. This is a paper we wrote, "The Future of Ecology is Collaborative, Inclusive, and Deconstructs Biases." In this article, we invited ecologists to join us in cultivating a paradigm shift that explores ways where inclusion complements research, supports an increasingly diverse community of young ecologists, and enhances our ability to solve the world's most pervasive and challenging ecological issues. So that's to set the stage. This work by Trissos et al. Came out just a few months ago. Decolonity and anti-oppressive practices for a more ethical ecology. This paper is really fantastic. They start off by explaining how ecology has been shaped by Western approaches, and that to make ecology inclusive, we must expand our theory and practices. They outlined 5 shifts that could help to transform academic ecological practice, beginning with decolonize your mind, know your histories, decolonize access, decolonize expertise, and practice ethical ecology in inclusive teams. And I think these can all be done by individuals, by lab groups, by departments even, and broader. But we can start as an individual thinking about, where do we start with decolonizing our mind? Who should we read? Who has written on this? Can we pick up a book and read about the history of the area that we are researching in, right? They highlight the fingerprint of colonialism on ecology today with this map of bird species named after European surnames. And we can see that in the Southern Hemisphere, in South America and in Africa, more names are related to European surnames. Taxonomy is used to organize the world. However, these names contain very little ecological information compared to pre-existing indigenous names related to species and habitats. So in this paper, they're encouraging science storytelling. They're encouraging changing bird species names back to the original native names that often include information not only about the species, but about the region that it's found. So a really cool paper. I highly recommend you check that out. I also thought this paper was really cool, that people have shaped most of terrestrial nature for at least 12,000 years. So we have in our head this idea that a pristine nature has the most biodiversity. But in fact, indigenous cultures have been cultivating and living with that biodiversity for thousands of years. And that in itself is not at all what has decreased biodiversity, but it is conversion or degradation of untouched ecosystems. So it's not that, but it's colonialization and intensification and use by lands inhabited previously inhabited by indigenous groups. So we need to, this is one of decolonizing our mind, right? Understanding that these misconceptions that biodiversity is from pristine areas, and if somebody had been there before, it wasn't as good, but actually understand that indigenous cultures have lived for thousands of years and biodiversity has thrived under those land use types. And furthermore, that those communities should be included in critical decision-making moving forward, whether that's management or conservation, because they have been stewards of the land for so long. Another silver lining of COVID, for me at least, has been to attend a number of seminars virtually around the world. And for me, this was really nice because often you're busy or maybe at the end of the workday, you want to just chill out. And often there are these seminars pre-recorded that you could watch or watch live. And I watched two that really made an impact, thinking about indigenous science and data. So decolonize data was one of the activities. And two scientists talked on this, Professor Gregory Cajati from Santa Clara Pueblo, New Mexico. And like he says, change starts with yourself, then your family, then your community, and then your environment. So if you start by decolonizing your own mind and then have conversations with your family and community, and then you can have an impact on the environment. Lydia Jennings, a postdoc, Dr. Lydia Jennings, a postdoc at the University of Arizona, also gave a talk about decolonizing data collection and working with indigenous communities. And she gave some really important points, specifically asking what questions are important to tribes, not what's important to you as a researcher, but what are important to tribes, and how can your skills support those tribes? And so go in with humility, not as if you are the colonizer, right? We're trying to turn away from that mindset. And instead, what can you do to support these communities? What are their goals? All right, another facet, improving sex and gender identity, equity, and inclusion at conservation and ecological conferences. I think this is a really nice thing to talk about. Here we see the proportion of keynote or plenary speakers who were women at each of the last 3 events for 10 total global conferences. You see the conferences on the right. If a circle is shaded in, that means these conferences had a code of conduct. And those without a code of conduct are empty circles, open circles. And what we see is that a conference with a code of conduct is more likely to have at least 50% of its speakers as women. And I think this is really, really important. Codes of conduct may seem boring, they may seem not very exciting, not related to research, but they can make a meeting, a society, a department more inclusive because people sit down, they think about what should be in a code of conduct, and ESA now has one. Another organization, AGU, there was a lot of publicity when they created one. They make a big difference because people feel like they then belong because they are being protected and taken care of within that society. There are dots that are colored below the lines. So then maybe go in and see what about our code of conduct is not supporting sex and gender identity equity. You could do this for then racial identity equity, right? There are many facets to think about in your code of conduct, but it can have a really big impact. This one is sort of heartbreaking. Perceptions of stereotypes applied to women who publicly communicate their STEM work. This is by Marian McKinnon and Christine O'Connell. Christine is actually an advisory board member on 500 Women Scientists. They found that gender biases and stereotypes are prevalent in science. That's not surprising. They looked at perceptions of stereotypes applied to women STEM professionals who publicly speak about their work in academic and non-academic settings. They used workshops with over 300 participants. And what they found is that women who publicly communicate their work are more likely to be stereotyped as bitchy, bossy, and emotional, often even by their own gender. And these findings suggest that women may be more vulnerable for implications further down in their career, but also for them to act as role model in their current position. So these are really important biases to acknowledge. Here's some other ones that they found, negatives. So if you're straightforward and commanding, you're bitchy. If you allow space for other voices to be heard, you're soft-spoken, which is a negative. If you provide a healthy and supportive environment where students thrive, you're motherly, also seen as a negative. If you're put together and professional, you're too pretty. I guess if you're distracted by things that are not valued in tenure, you're too service-oriented. So it's important to address these underlying biases so we can start to break them down and change our institutions. A new paper that just came out just last week, microbes from the Microbes and Social Equity Working Group. This is really cool. They outline opportunities for integrating microbiology and social equity work through broadening education and training, diversifying research topics, methods and perspectives, and advocating for evidence-based public policy that supports sustainable, equitable, and microbial wealth for all. I love this because they're combining their love of microbes with their social justice work and thinking about how, as a scientist, as researchers, can they contribute to social equity across society, not just in science. Because our science plays a role in many people's lives at some point. And so it's okay as scientists for us to advocate not only for our science, but also for it to be equitable and be supportive of the communities that our science supports. Another thing that we've seen develop over the last few years, as people want to characterize how many men and women are participating in different conferences, are professors, are considered mentors. We've seen an over and misuse of genderized programs. So there was a recent study that suggested that women are not as good of mentors as men and could be hurting the career prospects of their mentees. And we're gonna leave that one aside because it's a problematic study altogether. Genderize, there are many different programs. One, Capital Genderize is one of them you may be familiar with. They could not classify nearly 48% of the names because there are people that have names that are not gendered. There are people from non-Western countries that names cannot be gendered. And there are others who have names that maybe would misgender somebody. So it's incorrect to use these programs. And if they are to be used, they need to, if this is a question, more thought needs to be put into how the data is collected and analyzed. I want to give a shout out to Asma Berhi, who is a professor at the University of California, Merced. And she wrote this piece. It was part of a whole series and a platform for Black authors to share personal accounts about their life experiences and research in academia and reflect on the Black Lives Movement. So first of all, I just want to acknowledge that many more journals and magazines are making more space for voices that have typically been marginalized. So this is great. And I just love Asma's quote, "People of color and backgrounds hold biases, including racial biases, people of all color. When we acknowledge that we might hold biased views about one group or another, we can consciously work to put them in check and address their impacts." So thanks, Asmaret. Some other awesome work that has been done over the last year. Some of you may recognize Will Run for Soil, organized, it's led by Karen Vaughn, Yamina Pressler, and Lydia Jennings. And they are running around confronting ideas of what a scientist looks like, what it means to be a soil scientist, and what the human body is capable of accomplishing for the love of soil. So I just love this because it's showing a different aspect of a scientist, that we all don't fit into one specific type of box. Another example of that is this beautiful book, Lessons from Plants by Beronda Montgomery, where she says plants have strength, knowledge, and intelligence that are worthy of admiration in and of themselves, not because they affirm the ways in which we animals have those qualities. And so again, during the last year, a lot has gone on. And here's another example of not putting a scientist in a specific box, that art and creativity can be part of a scientist's identity and part of our scientific world. I'd love to know what other seminars that people really enjoyed this year. So NC's put together Advancing Ecology and Environmental Data Science for a More Just and Equitable Future. Also at the University of Minnesota, they had the pop-up global symposium about life and ecology for you. And I think what both of these symposia did was highlight that you don't just have to talk about your science, you can integrate in who you are to your work, because that allowing yourself to be who you are, when you are accepted by your peers and colleagues, by your discipline, you can be your best scientist. Okay, so all of this work that I've talked about today is really motivated by 500 women scientists. And I want to just take a moment to give a shout out to the work that we're doing, because we in November have our 5-year anniversary. And so let's just take a step back in time. So, oh man, almost 5 years ago, we were meeting at conferences, smiling, talking about microbes. I was growing plants in the greenhouse. I was voting for president in 2016. But the election did not go as many of us hoped. But the context catalyzed the formation of a new organization, a grassroots organization, 500 Women Scientists. We wrote a pledge, an open letter, in response to the political changes, because we saw it as an opportunity for scientists to re-examine and recommit to our values. Our group is led by women and led by women and scientists. Originally, we thought we'd write a pledge. We wrote this pledge and hoped 500 women scientists would sign. However, it far exceeded our our wildest dreams. And after a few months, more than 20,000 people from across the world had signed our pledge to make science more equitable and inclusive. And our values that we wrote down really resonated with scientists around the world. So the pledge kind of stepped to the side, and we decided to start our movement with our mission is to serve society by making science open, inclusive, and accessible, and added just a year and 2 years ago by Lauren Edwards, by fighting racism, patriarchy, and oppressive societal norms. Today, our organization has grown to over 500 local chapters around the world. We are an official nonprofit. We span 92 countries across 6 continents. We have members from all across STEM, including medicine. We have a volunteer leadership team, an advisory board, and as of 2021, we have 4 paid staff, including an executive director. So we've really grown very quickly. And our goal is to create an inclusive science. And we reiterate again and again that to do this, we must center our work on the experiences of the most marginalized among us. We need to stay committed to justice, confront our own privilege, and remain open to learning and growing in this work. How do we acknowledge the inequities? Whether that's acknowledging that only 28% of the STEM workforce are women, while 47% of the global workforce are women. That only 1 in 10 people working in science is a woman of color. Or that while white men and women make up 30% of the US population, white men hold 49% of science and engineering compared to 18% of women, of white women. And while Black, Hispanic, and Native women make up 16% of the US population, only make up 5% of science and engineering workforce. So there are huge discrepancies that we first must acknowledge. We can also see in ecology in NSF grant submissions. Maybe you thought this was getting better in biology. Here on the right, we see percentage of each rank. Men in blue have almost 60% assistant and then professor, and then that increases. Women are decreasing as they move up through the ranks. Other problems we need to acknowledge: racism and other forms of harassment. Sexual harassment in academia is fundamentally broken. There was this report by the National Academies put out a few years ago now. It really elucidates the challenges in the academy, and that sexual harassment is real. There are mentions of racial harassment and other forms of harassment, but an entire report should also be written on these other forms of harassment outside of sexual harassment. What are we doing to change the narrative? We've developed a database, Gauge, with over 14,000 women. You can no longer have an excuse for not having a woman present at your conference or a gender minority. Go to Gauge. You can find many women from any discipline around the world. We're also changing perceptions of what a scientist looks like, writing Wikipedia pages and editing them, training people to do this. Less than 30% of Wikipedia editors are women, and this has resulted in fewer pages for women scientists. Did you know Marie Curie shared a Wikipedia page with her husband for years until someone realized perhaps she should have her own? So changing perceptions of what a scientist looks like. We also created the Fellowship for the Future. We're supporting 2 cohorts right now and fundraising for a 3rd. This recognizes women of color leading in STEM. So how can you join the movement? I love this quote from PhD student Kat Court at UTEP. I've come to recognize that true solidarity means first considering how much my privilege I can offer or give up to help build networks of care and communication necessary to support those at the center of this work. She wrote about becoming a better advocate in a time of isolation. So if you want to help, what can you do? You can start with yourself. You can turn to your friends and families, peers and colleagues. You can take action in your department, university, in your city, or join regional, national, and global initiatives. You can work with the ESA. ESA has a number of sections thinking about equity and inclusion: inclusive ecology, Black ecologists, traditional ecological knowledge, environmental justice. They also offer anti-racism trainings. They are launching a scholars program to advance diversity in ecology. And they're participating in a self-assessment to look at their equity and inclusion processes that are in place. And as of August, one of their committees that was education and diversity will now just be focused on diversity. And hopefully by diversity, that also means inclusion and social justice. In order to advance the field of ecology, we need to advance and welcome the intellectual contributions of the full breadth of past, current, and aspiring ecological scientists. That is how we will make science more open, inclusive, and accessible. Thank you so much. I won't play the video because I realized that was a lot of time. Yeah, thank you again. Lots of support from 500 Women Scientists. My university, UTEP, has been really supportive of me working on this. The Netherlands Institute of Ecology also. So doing this work, doing outreach work while you're also a scientist can be difficult. So it's great to work at institutions that support you. And thank you for your time. And I am excited for the discussion next week.
All right, so thank you, Dr. Ramirez, for that great. You provided a really nice overview of some of the recent research related to diversity and equity, and it was really great to hear more about how you and your colleagues founded 500 Women Scientists. So just to everyone in the audience, please feel free to put questions in the comment or in the chat function for the meeting, and I will ask those. But just to give people a chance to think, maybe just to first start off, first of all, I'm just really, really impressed by your ability to not only found and run an international grassroots organization, which seems like, with fundraising and outreach seems just like an overwhelming job in itself, but you're also in, a tenure track research position. So how have you balanced your work with 500 Women Scientists with your research, academic research activities? And then maybe more broadly, what support have you gotten from your own academic institution, or more generally, how might academic institutions support meaningful large-scale engagement work by their faculty, especially pre-tenure faculty?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. It's really, thanks again for inviting me. It was really fun to record that in really hot weather last week. Balance, man. Sometimes I don't balance at all. Sometimes it's really, it feels really precarious. The success and continuation of 500 Women Scientists is really because Jane Zelikova and myself built up a team around us. Women wanted to work on the project who were awesome and supported us and the work. And so it really was a collaborative effort that could not have happened without that support. We have a team that tries to remind each other that when we're feeling we're putting too much into our nonprofit work, to take a step back and think about, our work, whether that's our work lives or our family lives, we need to think about. So surrounding yourself with people who can help remind you of that. And sometimes it's really hard to take a step back because this work, working in equity and inclusion, it's a space that you can't say we're going to do something and then not be there. It's right. Like we can't say we're going to start a fellowship and then have that fail. So it's really important that when we say we're going to do something, we follow through. And so sometimes it feels like we can't stop working. And that's why it's necessary to have people around you. to remind you to take breaks, which I have had to do multiple times. And Jane has stepped up and run the organization while I've been away. And then we built up an executive leadership team to support us. And now we have enough funds. So we have an executive director and 3 other staff members. And so that has allowed us to take a step back. I'm not really sure. I know the last 5 years happened. We're 5 years in November, but sometimes it's really a blur. And I think, yeah, so not only supportive colleagues and peers, so working with the Women of 500 Women Scientists, my institute, the NEO, where I was in Wageningen in the Netherlands, they were really supportive of my work of equity and inclusion and working on 500 Women Scientists and being a spokesperson thinking about that. So that was really great. And I took the position at UTEP partly because in the mission of this university is to think about marginalized communities. We're an 80% Hispanic university. So they recognize the value of the work that our org and others are doing. I think that support needs to come. It can't just be like, yay, pat on the back. You actually need to get credit for this work that is done. And I think that really hasn't happened enough in the past, especially for women of color who largely have led initiatives on diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice. They don't get the recognition or payment that's deserved. And so that's something that our organization really pushes for, to set examples that people should be paid for their work because it's making science better. It's making humans' lives better, right? That everyone is included. Was that all the questions?
Yeah, and I guess just generally, what are ways, or have you seen effective ways that institutions can support, pre-tenure faculty in particular with this work?
Yeah, so I'm maybe not the best person to answer that because I started 1.5 years ago, and 2.5 months into my professorship, COVID started. And so, I feel like I was supportive as best that they could have during a global pandemic. It's really hard for me to know about that. I think, yeah, like we're expected to do our research, we're expected to teach, and we're expected to do outreach. And I think the ways universities can support faculty, postdocs, graduate students is to really give them the recognition and space to do outreach work. I think that's really what it is, that it's weighted in the same manner that research and teaching is weighted. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it seems also useful that you've been able to get some, a publication or some research, out in academic journals related to your outreach work as well.
Yeah. And so that's part of 500 Women Scientists. It's like we think about things in a scientific way. We are scientists. So our database Gauge, where you can go and find women and non-gender minorities, looking for scientists, right? We've published a number of papers regarding that database and why it's important. And I think having data and viewing our work at 500 Women Scientists from a scientific perspective is that's something that we all really like. And I think it's really important to highlight the changes that need to be made. So those are publications that we get, but I think it's more like, are you enacting change in the community and how can people be rewarded for the work, whether they're mentoring students, because a lot of work that's done isn't like it is not visible. And so how can we make it more visible and highlight it?
Great, thanks. I'm going to go to some of the questions in the chat. So the first one, can you talk about the most difficult challenges that 500 Women Scientists has faced, and what are the most exciting opportunities it's created? So I guess challenges and moving forward, exciting things.
The biggest challenge, I think, as individuals running, like we're an all volunteer organization until the last year. And so it's really was finding, like you asked about balance, finding time that all of our volunteers can put in while doing their jobs that are paying them. So that has been the biggest challenge. I think biggest opportunities is like there's a lot of work to do. So I guess that's opportunities. There's always work to do in justice, equity, and inclusion. And we have a number of exciting projects. I think our Fellowship for the Future is amazing. Paying women of color for the work that they do in their communities with science. And I think that sets an example of we should be paying people for the work that they're doing. Other opportunities, let's see, we're highlighting the gap in payment for speakers. So if you're invited to give a talk, maybe you get $100 or $1,000 or $10,000. Women tend to be paid less. And so we're doing a whole research. Farah Kaiser, who I mentioned in my talk, she's actually one of the leaders on that project. So there's some great opportunities for not only data collection to better understand, but then to break down the systems that are in place that are suppressing marginalized communities, marginalized folks.
Great, thanks. So another question from the audience. So how would you suggest that graduate students or postdocs help make EEB more inclusive and equal, especially given that students and postdocs aren't the ones with financial or hiring power?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. So I think there are a number of ways to start. One is educating yourself. And so that paper I referenced, Decolonize Your Mind, I think that's a great place to start at an individual level. So you start to change and normalize discussions around equity and inclusion in your own peer group. So with other graduate students and with other postdocs, right? And even with undergraduates, a lot of undergraduate, they're thinking about these things too. So like really changing who's interacting with, like thinking about these, anyone can make a difference in this space. If everyone in the graduate program wants to make a change, wants a code of conduct, let's say for your department, if the graduate students bring that forward, the faculty will probably listen if everyone came together, right? So there you can enact change. It's not like always a hierarchy coming down. Sometimes requires a lot more work and can be painful, but definitely change can be enacted. I think most of this work, I was actually a postdoc, so I wasn't faculty. So I was doing this work as a postdoc. We have faculty on our leadership team. But we've also had graduate students, we've had undergrads, we've had people who don't have a doctorate, right? Anyone can be a scientist, and that's also something that 500 Women thinks about, 500 Women Scientists. Like we talk about, you don't have to have a specific degree to be a scientist. If you have undergrads that you're TAing that are excited about science, maybe they want to go into a totally different field, but they want to learn about science and how to think about science in their own life. I think that can make a really big difference. I think there are a lot of ways, whether that's being involved in your university, in a society like ESA, there are a lot of awesome chapters. No, not chapters. What's the word that I want? All the different sections that you can join. Yeah, sections. Or your community. So we have 500 Women Scientists has pods, our local chapters, and our chapters really focus on what is important in their community. So in El Paso, our chapter does nature hikes and bringing people out, just introducing them to biology in very, not complicated ways, but having really cool discussions about fungi and pollinators that are out in the desert, right? With people who maybe haven't had that experience before, but that's really specific to El Paso. Our Boulder, Colorado pod, where more people are already interacting with nature, they focus on policy, for example, right? And how can science have a voice in policy? So it's really what you're passionate about, what you will get excited about in this space, and then what's important in your community.
Great, thanks. So again, from the chat, someone says, thanks a lot for amazing, inspiring work and talk. The work that 500 Women Scientists does is great, but what about language barriers in ecology, and what role, do you have any thoughts about how to approach language barriers. And I know you've had a lot of international experience. And so are there any thoughts that you have in terms of making ecology more accessible from a language perspective?
That's a great question. And I don't think I have I'm probably not educated enough in this. My work in Europe, right, it was an international institution where we had people from mostly all over Europe there. So lots of different first languages, but the language of science does tend to be English. I think though that taking time, so whether that's societies or institutions that want to have a global impact, I think it's important for them to think about and plan, like, does this need to be translated? And are there specific resources that need to be made available? We do that for 500 Women Scientists. We're working to translate a lot of our resources. For example, our team wrote a guide how to create inclusive scientific meetings, and that's in English. And so now a group reached out and they want to translate that to Spanish, right? And so it takes time though. So perhaps it's also something where when societies or departments or universities are making strategic plans, that those deciding that resources need to be spent on that accessibility. And like thinking about what other ways can we interact, whether that's on Twitter or Instagram or some other social media where there's translation potential to cross those barriers. I think it's something that we struggle with in our organization to make sure that we're accessible by translating. But it takes resources and time. And so finding people to do that can be really hard for our small organization. But I think it's definitely something that comes up that we think about a lot, like how can we direct resources to this? Because it's global. How can we need to continue thinking about it. And I think there are opportunities for creative ideas as well for specific events or activities that bring people together where there are translations available so people can interact and share ideas. I don't know. I'm probably not the best. Probably other people on here are like, we work on this.
Yeah, so put that in the discussion of the chat section. That'd be great if people in the audience have other resources to suggest. So that does kind of lead into the next question from the audience, which is, your work with 500 Women Scientists is certainly operating at the national and international level. But I guess, how do you decide when to focus your efforts on local activities, outreach activities at the local level versus at the national or international level? And maybe, I guess that's for you personally. Are you involved with local work at your institution, or how do you balance that kind of global focus with on the ground local work?
For me, it actually has been really hard to focus as much locally as I want to, because I put so much of my time in to our national organization that thinks more about strategizing and communicating resources to our different local chapters. So then by the time I'm done with work and I go on my run, I just want to take a nap. I think that, again, it comes down to like what's really keeps me motivated. And so for me, I'm really motivated to see the work that others are doing in their local communities and then connecting them through 500 Women Scientists and amplifying their work. So that's my priority and learning about it. When we travel, like before COVID, anytime I traveled somewhere, I would try to meet the local pod that was there and talk with them in person. So that's been really sad to not get to meet people on the ground thinking about local issues. And then getting to bring those back to leadership and be like, this is what these people are working on. We do have a pod coordinator now, we have a staff member, and her role is to link people locally, or like link people nationally or internationally and share what's going on locally. So that's something that we're working on. Yeah, I mean, yeah, now that, well, it's really weird. That was really weird listening to me talk about COVID, because in the last week and a half, things have got a lot worse with the Delta variant. So even just in that short amount of time where I was like thinking I'm going to go back to El Paso and things will be like, I'll be interacting with more humans again. And I don't think that's really going to happen. So I'm curious. I still like, I'm still getting into my own local community, right? It takes some time when you move somewhere. So yeah, I don't know how other people decide where to put their time and energy.
Yeah, I mean, I think at some level it comes down to, you know, what you're passionate about and where your passion and skills lie in terms of balancing kind of big picture administration stuff versus grounds interacting with people. So another question from the chat: does 500 Women Scientists have any initiatives to support queer and trans women specifically?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't currently, and we have typically tried to amplify partner organizations and individuals that work on other things because it's not our specialty. That being said, we welcome ideas and people to join our leadership and team, and like volunteers who, if you have a project that you're like, I have a great idea to change how we, so for example, I showed that slide about the Genderize program, that where people are using Genderize to say this is a man or woman, and like without any that, and that's it, right? And 48% of the names were misgendered. And so like, this is something we've been thinking about a lot. Like, can we write a paper? What would be a different program? Juniper Simonis, they've been advising us on this. They're on our advisory board. And I mean, part of it is just like capacity, but that's a project that we would love to explore more. If there are partners out there who maybe have already started this, we could at least amplify, or if somebody wants to work with the team, because there are a lot of directions to go. And I think we're sort of waiting for both the right leader, because it's a space that we can't just jump into and say, we're going to fix this too, right? That's something that we think about. It's who would lead that, and do they have capacity, and what resources can we give to support them?
Okay, great, thanks. And that makes me kind of connect to another question that I had, which is, you know, how are people who aren't necessarily in the target demographic of 500 Women Scientists, you know, are you aware of similar programs that build small support groups, or are there, you know, what would you suggest to people who are looking for that same sort of networking and support that 500 Women Scientists provide, that maybe don't necessarily connect with your group in particular?
Yeah, to me, so I've been really bad the last year and a half. I haven't been on social media as much. I have seen there are some great communities on Twitter via either hashtag or follow their whether that's Black in STEM, or there's 500 queer scientists, right? So like following those groups. I think that, I mean, obviously that's more dispersed because it's like social media. I would also suggest like checking out the sections at ESA. And if there's not one that you feel like calls to you, or you're like, this isn't really what I'm looking for, maybe start a new one, because I think there are definitely, ESA seems like they're really wanting our community to be supportive in lots of different ways, and giving people space to talk about their needs of their own community, which is great. Because we used to have like the plant ecology section and the microbial, right? It was by discipline, and now it's a lot more by through an intersectional lens, I think. And so if your intersectionality isn't being accommodated. And I think that 500 Women Scientists, while we are a women-led organization, our pod activities and outreach definitely goes for everyone, all individuals, and we welcome anyone to volunteer with us. So there just are specific and events where we have women-led events, but everything else. So, and if you're like, well, we just, you know, we can amplify too for you. So we can say, if you're like, we want to start this, reach out to us and we can help you amplify what you're doing and help connect you. If that's of service, if that's helpful.
All right, great. So another question from the chat. So this is switching gears a little bit, but thinking about funding institutions. So I assume like federal funding agencies or other funding agencies. Do you think that if those sorts of agencies had requirements within their applications, grant applications, for activities that target, justice, equality, diversity, equity initiatives, do you think that would have a positive impact on how science is done?
I don't know why it wouldn't have a positive impact. I mean, I think that we've seen even in the last, since I left the States and when I came back, and like NSF grants and the focus on what broader impacts means has really gotten more in depth. It's not as superficial feeling as it used to be. And I think the same could be true if there are more specific asks for JEDI topics, because there are expected outcomes from the funding agency expects outcomes. So in broader impacts, if you say we're going to go out to schools and talk about our research and do this sort of thing, you can't just say that, you have to do it. And I think that if they include something about JEDI, then that would also have an impact. You have to actually go out and do the thing that you're going to do. I think there's a difference though, then maybe there's not a difference. So if you say you're going to go to pre-K through 12 and teach, but you're a research scientist that has no background in teaching pre-K through 12, you need to hire somebody and pay them to help you, maybe a consultant or a specific teacher group, right, that is helping you translate your research. And the same is true for JEDI. You can't just write it in and say that you're going to do it if you're not an expert in it. And so then you need to think about, are we going to hire consultants? Who are the people that we're going to partner with and work with and do the outreach that we say? So I think that's an important component, as I hope funding agencies move towards that. I've seen like more calls that require that. And we see even applying for tenured track positions, they ask for diversity statements. And that can have an impact on hiring, because you can see if it's superficial or not, and if people are actually contributing to their community and thinking about it. So I guess that was a long-winded answer. Yes.
Good. All right. So another question from the chat. Is there any project or advice that you would give to people who might have had to quit a graduate program due to racism or sexism and who have tried to restart another one, or women who might be looking at second careers in academics or research? Are there, I guess, any project within 500 Women Scientists or elsewhere that you know of that might be good resources?
Mm-hmm. That's a really hard question. I think on a more like personal level, I do think we have people in our organization that have shared their stories. So our executive director, Lauren Edwards, was in a PhD program and she decided to leave because it was toxic, it was racist, and she applied to med school and is now going to med school. You can read about her story on our website, and she wrote I think it's on Sister STEM, maybe. Oh, anyways, I can find it if you really, you can find it. But anyways, Lauren told a very candid story about her experience. So there's that option, like being able to share your story or hear from others that you're not the only one, and that this is a problem. This is a problem that we can't just fix overnight. And similar, so also for women who are leaving their career, or perhaps if you're a mom and you've had to take some time away, we have SciMom Journeys, hashtag SciMom Journeys, and our volunteers think a lot about what can be done at the policy level. And so that's something, so going from the individual, we have support groups. We also have the Black Women's Collective of 500 Women Scientists that we're working on, and we have SciMom Journeys. So those are two current support or groups that are working within 500 Women Scientists that are thinking about how to bring women together, but also enact change. And then we're thinking about policy, which is definitely a challenge. And we've been working to find funding to like, how can we actually enact policy changes that will help racial, sexual harassment, homophobia in science? Like, how can we actually change policies so they'll have an impact on people?
All right, thanks. So it looks like we are almost out of time, and I think we've addressed most of the questions that came up in the chat. So I think with that, we will wrap things up. Thank you, Dr. Ramirez, for your talk and for your, taking your time to share your perspective and your experiences with 500 Women Scientists. There's a lot, I think, inspiring, and hopefully will generate future discussions and actions among our membership. So thanks again.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Enjoy the meeting.